Well, good evening. Can you hear me? Is this on? Seems like it's coming through. No, it is not on. Okay. Okay. All right. Just not close enough, maybe. That's okay. I usually don't have a hard time being heard. Welcome on behalf of the Board of Trustees of the Winchester Foundation. I'm Chris Talley, its chairman, served in that capacity for a number of years, and I want to issue a heartfelt welcome to all of you for coming out this evening and listen to what I think will be a most interesting presentation and talk about American exceptionalism from the view of perhaps a Frenchman by the name of Tocqueville may enter into the conversation. I'm not sure, and I don't want to be presumptuous. So we're starting on time because that is a tradition that was steeped in the activities of Pierre Goodrich, both his philanthropic activities as well as his business activities. He believed in starting on time and ending on time in meetings and other associations and gatherings. And about something over 75 years ago, he established something called the Winchester Foundation, and I can think of no better way to make a few remarks this evening than to simply quote from him what he thought the Winchester Foundation should do and its general purposes. He found it interesting to find people, anyone that would be interested and might contribute and become a part of the encouragement and stimulation of interest in the study of the arts, music, philosophy, religion, community thrift and savings, humanities, government, and political science. That's a quote of the general purposes of the Winchester Foundation. It's clear Mr. Goodrich believed in an education steeped in the liberal arts, and he stayed true to that principle, both in theory and in practice throughout his life. His experiences at Wabash College for a number of years challenged his principle, his belief in the role of education and its purpose, that being in the spirit of the Greeks, in the paideia of a cult that prescribes for a culture of freedom, for a culture of responsible citizenship in a civil society. And he lived and practiced what he preached in that regard. This Winchester Foundation was launched in 1945 by the board of directors of People's Loan and Trust Company, that was a bank here in town for a number of years. Pierre Goodrich was its president, and this launch in 1945 of this experiment in philanthropy has led to two other foundations that are significantly involved in the promoting of the study of the ideal of a society of free and responsible individuals, staying true to the principles of Mr. Goodrich and what he wanted done with his philanthropy. I could go on about that, but let's turn more to the business at hand this evening. I think you'll find that this program on American exceptionalism fits very well into how Pierre Goodrich believed the role of education should contribute to responsible citizenship and good civics. My pleasure now to introduce the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Presbyterian Church to introduce our keynote speaker. Marty, would you please join us? Mr. Marty Sulik.
I don't have quite the stentorian voice of Chris, so I'll lean into the mic a bit. Everyone can hear? Okay, I had some prepared remarks for introducing Les, but in my typical fashion, I lost them, so I'm going to wing it. But luckily, I've known Les Dr. Lenkowsky. There they are. Well, okay, I don't even need them anyway. Luckily, I've known Dr. Lenkowsky for 25 years now. My first day at Indiana University, which was then IUPUI, Indianapolis, in 1998, I signed up for a Master's of Arts in Philanthropic Studies, and one of the courses that was on offer was Civil Society I can't remember if it was the comparative perspective or the other one that was, but I signed up for it, and not only was it my first course that I took at IUPUI, it was the first course that Dr. Lenkowsky taught. He had just been recruited there. He had formerly been the president of the Hudson Institute. He's got a lot of other things on his resume before that. He was a PhD graduate of Harvard University, where he worked under Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who kind of went on to become big in the Senate. And then I got to be exposed to this whole idea of civil society and civil society theory as a political theory, which was very pertinent for me, having spent time in Eastern Europe and witnessed the aftermath of the revolutions that occurred there in 1989 and 1990. So I was very interested to hear Dr. Lenkowsky's perspective on it. And then when we were organizing this conference, we were discussing what the theme of the conference should be, and we were bandying about civil society and civic renewal, civic society and individual responsibility. And people went around the table, and it's like, well, does anyone know who we could get for a keynote speaker? And I was like, yeah, I think I know. I think I know who could fill that bill pretty well. Since teaching at IUPUI, Dr. Lenkowsky actually went on to head up the Corporation for Public Service in Washington, which under its umbrella were things like the Peace Corps and various other government organizations that sponsor volunteerism in America and internationally. So when I say Dr. Lenkowsky is an expert in this field, I don't mean just as a dry academic that has a bunch of theory and nothing really practical to say. He's got it from both sides, and I'm very, very proud to have him speak at our conference opening today, and so I would like to turn it over to him right now.
Thank you very much, Marty. I think this will be about right. It's a pleasure being here with you tonight, and especially to see some of my former students here as well. There are a few things more satisfying. I retired 5 years ago from full-time teaching, but there's very few things that are more satisfying than to see one's former students make their way in their careers and their communities and become leaders in their own right. It's really like watching those seeds sprout. But I think this is probably the first time, Marty, that a former student has actually introduced me. So I'm grateful to you for that, and also grateful that you didn't tell some of those stories that both of us know well. I'm honored to participate in this commemoration of the life of Pierre Goodrich. Although I never knew him, I have been engaged in the work of the Liberty Fund for close to 5 decades and benefited from it. While foundations often re-examine their priorities and reset their programs every few years, the Liberty Fund has remained steadfast in its aim of enriching, as it says, the appreciation and understanding of the complex nature of a society of free and responsible individuals. For all the fund has accomplished through its seminars, publications program, and other activities, we need this sort of knowledge more than ever today. My involvement with the work of the Liberty Fund deepened in 1990 when I succeeded Mitch Daniels as president of the Hudson Institute, then based in Indianapolis. I had not lived in the Midwest before. If you listen carefully, you can hear a bit of my native New York accent in my diction. And in the crowd I hung around with, moving to Indiana was like going to a foreign country. Never take a job in Indiana, a friend who had grown up in Chicago told me, because if it doesn't work out, you'll never find anything else to do there. As it happens, when I left Hudson in 1997, the best place for me to land was right in Indianapolis, at what is now the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Except for a short leave in Washington, I happily spent the rest of my career there and in the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. In other words, I became a neo-Hoosier. I obtained my undergraduate education and not coincidentally met my future wife at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the heart of Amish country in that part of the world. It was a pleasure seeing a buggy on the highway, the road as I came up here. I still remember looking out the train window en route to my admissions interview, seeing a horse and buggy on the road. I wondered if I was making the right choice. In the first week of classes, a professor shocked my classmates and me, most of us from the metropolitan suburbs on the East Coast, by telling us that if we did not like the small, semi-rural city we found ourselves in, we do not really like America. As I have learned, especially after spending so much of my career in Indiana, he was right. In his accounts of the lives of Pierre Goodrich and other members of the Goodrich family, as well as of Winchester, Indiana, Dane Starbuck bears this out. He notes the extraordinary number of people from here who not only achieved considerable personal success, but also made significant contributions to society. Public officials, scientists, jurists, artists, inventors, statesmen, and business leaders, among others. And those are only the people known to history, not those who, as George Eliot wrote, performed unhistoric acts. That things are not so ill with you and me, she added in Middlemarch, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. For a small, hard-to-reach town surrounded by farms and without major centers of learning, Winchester seems to have nurtured many extraordinary people in the 19th and 20th centuries, including the one we are remembering now. Dane asks the right question. Why? There is no common thread, he answers, but notes the work ethic instilled by rural life, the religious and family backgrounds of those who lived here, and not least importantly, the high value they placed on education. All of these were important, but I would like to suggest something like a common thread which helps to account not only for the large number of successful people who emerged from Winchester, but also for many other communities like Winchester, including Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It is the role of what is called civil society, the networks of formal and informal associations people establish, and the personal and social benefits they generate. It was a feature of American life even before the United States was founded, and helped make this country an exceptional nation. Many, however, think it is now endangered. According to a recent book by John K. Lauk, the historian, the Midwest in the 19th century was the epicenter of civil society in the United States. In A Good Country, he argues that during the 19th century, nowhere in the United States, indeed in the world, was democracy as far advanced as in the 12 states of the Midwest, then more often called the Northwest. There was, he writes, and I quote, a communally agreed to ideal, a model of behavior, a goal to be striven for, a moral code, a way of inspiring the young, a motivation for civic duty, a virtuous patriotism, a recognition of civic obligations, and perhaps most telling, a willingness to bleed and die for one's home, especially as against sinful rebels who put the young republic at risk. Social equality, Lauk writes, was the norm. Religion was ubiquitous, immigrants plentiful, and literacy was high. By the Civil War, he says, over 90% of Midwesterners could read, and most middle-class families owned books. Though initially limited to white men, the right to vote extended further and with fewer conditions such as property ownership than in other parts of the United States. Rooted in agriculture and later in small businesses, its economy reinforced what Lauk terms the moral teachings of Christian Victorian culture. Even so, in Lauk's view, the Midwest was a good country, but not a perfect one. Although women played a larger role in the region's civic and cultural life than they did in other parts of the country, they faced obstacles to voting and holding office that changed only slowly. While slavery was legally prohibited, various forms of discrimination were practiced in many states, including Indiana. Though frequently mistreated as well, Native Americans, Lauk reports, often fared better than black people. Still, the Midwest became a hotbed for reform movements, not least of all for ending slavery. The first abolitionist paper was called The Philanthropist and published in Cincinnati in the second decade of the 19th century. Eventually, the Civil War solidified the region's identities and was memorialized in statues, pageants, and other ways. Lauk argues that underpinning the democratic ethos of the Midwest was the least well-known of the nation's founding documents, the Northwest Ordinance. Produced in 1787 by the short-lived Confederation Congress, it is usually understood as setting out a method and requirements for admitting new states to the Union. But it was much, much more. In advance of the United States Constitution, it included a Bill of Rights that protected religion, the right to jury trials, and the ownership of property. Finding, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, end of quote, it proclaimed that the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And most importantly, the ordinance prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude in the region, though it allowed for the return of fugitive slaves to other parts of the country. According to Lauk, the ordinance was not simply a piece of parchment to the residents of the Midwest. To the youthful Midwestern states, he writes, it was no less than a regional Magna Carta, which left its imprint on their political cultures. It spurred constitutional conventions and competitive elections to chart a pathway to statehood. It protected the flourishing of religious expression as people from the eastern and southern states, as well as Europe, moved into the new territories. It kept slavery and its peculiar social arrangements below the Ohio River. Senator John C. Calhoun, in fact, regularly called the Northwest Ordinance a sin against the South. And it led to the creation of an extraordinary number of schools, not only elementary and secondary ones, but also academies for higher education, many of which continue to exist. By the middle of the 19th century, the Midwest had developed a vibrant civic life built around its churches, schools, and omnipresent societies for art, music, philosophy, and literature. Theaters and opera houses grew common, as did public sculpture, Lauk reports. Much of this commitment, he writes, was driven by prominent charities, generous individuals, and general civic commitment. He adds, Midwestern elites saw civic and cultural stewardship as a duty. After the Civil War, the influence of the Midwest expanded, including in the nation's political life, reaching what Lauk calls peak Midwest by the end of the century. Lauk ends his history there. One hopes what happened afterward will be the subject of his next book or someone else's. But he leaves us with a picture of the Midwest as it was known to the Goodriches and the many others who grew up in Winchester in the 19th century and went on to make indelible marks on American society. Historians, writers, and social critics have often portrayed the region, like Lauk notes, as the old square world. But in his view, it was really the epitome of American exceptionalism. Whether or not the United States really is an exceptional nation has long been and continues to be debated. In 2009, President Obama acknowledged under questioning that he thought it was, but that other countries, he added, lest anyone feel badly, other countries believed they were exceptional too. A starting point for this debate was a 1906 book published by a German sociologist and historian named Werner Sombart. Why is there no socialism in the United States? A Marxist who embraced some elements of Nazism, he believed that capitalism contained the seeds of its own destruction, and that a market-driven economy would, in its latter stages, give way to more government direction and control. He saw that happening in Europe at the time, but not in the United States, even though its economy was already well on the way to moving from agricultural to industrial. He and others have offered a variety of explanations for this apparent anomaly. Since American workers came from different ethnic, racial, religious, and national backgrounds, creating a unified labor movement to press for political change was difficult. The openness of the American economy and society at the time, and especially the untapped potential of the frontier, served as a safety valve of sorts, giving those who were unhappy with their lot avenues to try to improve it, besides fighting against the existing system. American political institutions, especially at the national level, were designed to have limited power and were often controlled by those favoring business interests. In any case, the evidence Sombart presented for the historical inevitability of capitalist decline was as shaky as the Marxist analysis on which it rested. As sociologist Daniel Bell later wrote, Sombart's book should have really been titled, "Why Should There Be Socialism in the United States?" arguing that, and I quote, "there is no exception because there is no rule." A better case could be made that the United States was what one scholar called the first new nation, breaking with previous patterns of political and social development. Indeed, such a case was made, as Chris anticipated, by Alexis de Tocqueville in his classic work, Democracy in America. The scion of a family that had suffered during the French Revolution, he came to the United States in 1831, ostensibly to study new methods of running prisons, but in reality, to understand why, though motivated by similar ideals, the American Revolution had turned out better than the one in his own country. In less than a year, he traveled widely to Green Bay in the west, New Orleans in the south, Quebec in the north, along the Ohio River, up and down the East Coast, and took copious notes, which he spent much of the 1830s turning into the 2 volumes of his book. Democracy in America begins by calling for a new science of politics, one that accounts for a new principle which the United States had embraced, that all men are created equal. Tocqueville describes how this idea affected the country's laws and political institutions, its customs, the relations between the sexes, its literature and arts, and much more. While he does not stint on criticism and sometimes overlooks or misinterprets important developments, he also showed how these features of American life contributed to the country's success. By contrast, their absence created obstacles to democracy and economic growth in nations or regions like the South, built around different principles, such as deference to kings and aristocrats or slave owners. Particularly relevant tonight is Tocqueville's discussion of the uses Americans make of civic associations. Everywhere he went, he reported, the people he saw were creating organizations for all sorts of purposes, from making local improvements to conducting wide-ranging reform movements. Tocqueville explained this by the absence of a class of benefactors and the limited powers accorded government. But he also saw that the need for the public to undertake these tasks had several salutary effects, including teaching participants the skills and habits of working together and forcing them to moderate their own preferences and desires to compromise with others to achieve common goals. Or, as we would say today, civic groups help build social capital, the relationships among people that can be as valuable as the money in our pockets or expertise in our heads. To Tocqueville, the science of association, the knowledge of how to create and conduct civic organizations, was the mother of science, a key to making democracy function effectively. Winchester was little more than a decade old when Tocqueville traveled to the United States. But if he had come here, and he did get as close as Cincinnati, he would have seen its small population building and using social capital. A post office, a vital channel for sharing information about local and national issues in those pre-social media days, began operating in 1820. By 1845, Randolph County had established a racially integrated school, the Union Literary Institute. School books, like the McGuffey Reader, taught the virtues of performing local acts of kindness, and so numerous and active were Protestant missionary and social reform groups prior to the Civil War that historians referred to the period as one of a benevolent empire. As Lauk shows, Winchester and the many other Winchesters throughout the Midwest and the rest of the United States were part of it. By time Tocqueville returned to France, the American population had begun to change rapidly, inexorably, and thoroughly. Between 1820 and 1850, immigration, mostly from Ireland and Germany, had raised the number of Catholics in the United States from 195,000 to 1.6 million, making Catholicism the largest religious denomination in the country. In the years following the Civil War, the number continued to rise, driven by high birth rates and immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. It reached an estimated 12 million people by the end of the 19th century. Immigrants from Asia and the Jewish diaspora of Eastern Europe further diversified, to use today's word, the population, and gave rise to a backlash that culminated in the immigration restrictions of the 1920s. Yet surprisingly, a century of population change made little difference in the propensity of Americans to form civic associations and may even have increased it. Faced with real or perceived discrimination, Catholics created their own networks of schools, social service organizations, political clubs, and other groups to serve their communities. Jewish immigrants, like my own grandparents, joined one of the many Landsmannschaften in big cities, mutual aid societies that performed a variety of tasks aimed at helping their members fit into their new country. In the South, recently emancipated slaves formed organizations to provide public services that segregationist governments refused to offer. The National Park Service is currently studying the feasibility of creating the first national historic site in honor of a philanthropist, Julius Rosenwald, CEO of the Sears Roebuck Company, and the Rosenwald Schools, some 5,000 elementary and secondary schools built with his support between 1910 and 1930 in African American counties below the Mason-Dixon line. When one immigrant, Andrew Carnegie, became the wealthiest man in the world at the end of the 19th century and began giving his money to build public libraries, he challenged the communities interested in having one to agree to provide support for their upkeep. It is probably no coincidence that Indiana received the largest number of his grants, with Illinois and Iowa not far behind. The end of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th saw the development of many other civic groups as well. Rotary and Kiwanis, the Boys and Girls Clubs, the YMCA and child welfare movements, United Ways, and community foundations, to name just a few. It was, one historian termed it, a golden age of fraternity, though women were full participants too. When the Spanish flu struck in 1918, it was met with, quote, a much higher sense of civic duty, unquote. An expert on that pandemic said, than we saw when COVID arrived a few years ago. How come? We know why Americans were so civic-minded in 1918, but why were they less so, if that was the case, 100 years later? And what does this change say about the exceptional uses of civic associations Americans have historically made? In the mid-1990s, Harvard professor Robert D. Putnam brought public attention to the weakening of civil society with an article that later became a book called Bowling Alone: The Collapse and Revival of American Community. Using a variety of surveys, he argued that volunteering, giving, and membership in a wide range of organizations had been falling since the 1960s. The book's title came from a drop in the number of bowling leagues, a matter of no small consequence to bowling alley operators who derived a large share of their revenue from selling refreshments during league competitions. Although confident in the accuracy of what he was reporting, Putnam acknowledged he had no entirely convincing explanation. He pointed to the increased television watching that started with the baby boomers as the most likely culprit. But others issued similar warnings as well. A Blue Ribbon Commission, co-chaired by former Senator Sam Nunn and former Education Secretary William Bennett, claimed the United States was well on its way to becoming a nation of spectators, not citizens. Another Harvard scholar, Theda Skocpol, who focused on the problems of organizations like Rotary and Kiwanis, perceived, as had Putnam, a threat to democracy itself in their declining memberships. Long before COVID or Donald Trump arrived on the scene, among scholars and policymakers, as well as in many communities where long-established groups like United Ways were facing challenges, the belief that the United States had a growing civic deficit was widespread. Not everyone agreed with this assessment. One critic of Putnam's work pointed out that while we may be bowling alone more often these days, we are also kicking soccer balls together more frequently than we used to. Others noted that organizations which were important at one time had become less so, like labor unions, because American industry had changed. Competition mattered too. United Ways were an efficient way to raise money when they were created, but other, more direct methods, such as appeals by mail or telephone, had developed. Putnam himself seems to have reconsidered his earlier findings. In his most recent book, more optimistically titled The Upswing: How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again, in that book he contends the decline in joining that he had documented earlier might really just have been a dip in a much longer cycle which has already turned upwards. Whether the uses Americans make of civic associations is greater or less now, they have certainly changed. When I came to Indianapolis in the 1990s, to head a think tank, I unexpectedly found myself part of the city's business and civic leadership as a member of a group called the Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee. Created in 1965, it had played a central role in shepherding the city's development through turbulent times. While it still exists, a recent study of civic leadership in Indianapolis indicates that many other organizations, speaking for a much wider range of interests, now have seats at the table. Although potentially improving decision-making, the inclusion of more voices also increases the difficulty of mastering the science of association. Other features of civic life have also changed. 20 years ago, the Census Bureau started asking Americans about how often they volunteered for organizations like churches and charities. It turns out that a smaller share of the population than one might have expected does so regularly. About 1 in 4 adults in the tally last year. But twice as many say that they provide help informally to friends and neighbors, and this is probably an underestimate. Some people, for example, may view service to a congregation or a child's school as not truly voluntary. In any case, Professionalization in the nonprofit sector has grown enormously over the past few decades, presumably making them more effective, but reducing the scope for volunteers. A smaller proportion of Americans gives money to charity too. At the beginning of this century, my colleagues at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy estimate that about 2/3 of households made donations annually. Now they say have to, with much of the drop coming after the Great Recession of 2008-2009. Between last year and the year before, because of the poor economy, giving in inflation-adjusted dollars declined more than in any similar period for 70 years. However, the American population is different from what it was in 2000. It has fewer people who identify as religious, more who are immigrants or minorities, and fewer in the middle class. All of these factors reduce the likelihood of giving, at least in the short term. Charities have also become less dependent on donations and more reliant on earned income, such as tuition fees and various kinds of government support. The result is that despite Internal Revenue Service efforts to revoke tax exemptions for organizations that no longer operate, it has more nonprofits on its books than ever. While the share of givers has been dropping, the amount of gifts has been rising steadily, except for last year, and new ways of providing support, such as donor-advised funds, have grown in popularity. These are all national trends, but there is little reason to think that Winchester and towns like it have not been influenced by them. A few years after I came to the Midwest, Commentary magazine, a prestigious, conservative-leaning New York-based monthly, asked me to participate in a symposium on the national prospect. My assignment was to write about what it looked like from the nation's heartland. There is much to be optimistic about, I wrote, as traditional values still infuse much of civic life. But, I added, places like Indianapolis cannot isolate themselves from the major streams of American culture. Citing the media, higher education, and even shopping malls, which brought the latest ads, slogans, and fashions to shape a city's style. The Midwest would be shaped, I argued, by the tension between its traditional civic values and the modern and postmodern ones of our increasingly national and international culture. I would imagine that is just as true in Winchester as it was in Indianapolis. Pierre Goodrich's life illustrates how to achieve success and influence in the worlds of business and government while remaining faithful to, indeed advancing, traditional civic values. The uses Midwesterners and Americans continue to make of their civic associations makes this balancing act possible. Although never unconstrained or unchallenged, the freedom and expectation to do both is what makes the United States exceptional as well as complex. Mr. Goodrich was not a person who gave many interviews to the press, but while writing a short biographical sketch of him several years ago, I came across a clipping that described his work on behalf of the Great Books Foundation. This well-to-do Indianapolis lawyer and corporate director, the son of a former governor and advisor to presidents, had suddenly taken the story, said, to touring Indiana's small towns, sleeping in second-class hotels, eating in hamburger joints, rubbing elbows with plain folks. All this to get them to join groups to discuss the ideas of Aristotle, Plato, St. Thomas Aquinas, Shakespeare, John Locke, Rousseau, and others. This is a wonderful reflection, not only on Mr. Goodrich personally, but on the civic ethos from which he came, that enabled and encouraged successful business leaders to be civic leaders too. We cannot recreate that era, but we can be faithful to its spirit, as we need to be in these troubled times. Thank you very much.
So in the spirit of civic participation as opposed to aristocratic deference, I would like to open it up to questions from the audience, if anyone has any, for Dr. Lenkowsky. Would you like the mic?
So on the rise and decline of the Midwest culture and our cultural relevance, I was wondering if you might have any thoughts on what the railroads had to do with it. Because when you were talking about the rise of the Midwest, you mentioned there was a huge burst of culture and whatnot post-Civil War. During the Civil War, Abe Lincoln built hundreds of miles of railroad all throughout the Midwest and the Northeast Corridor to fund the war machine and supply it. And then further along in the decline, you mentioned in the 1960s and the mid-20th century, that is exactly when the railroads were shutting down these places, these passenger lines. And what I'm getting at isn't necessarily the railroads itself, but the density of which society existed because of them. You had to walk everywhere. And I don't know, the idea I have is that maybe civic society and duty arises from the density of populations, and with the decline of dense urban transit, such as trains and intermodal, that has led to the decline. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
That's an excellent question. You should write the book on the 20th century. Certainly one you'd want to look at. I think Lauk would say, and I've never met the man, I was just impressed by his book, would say that the creation of the railroads undoubtedly increased Midwestern influence. It brought Midwestern culture all around the country, leading to what he called peak Midwest. Well, yeah, I'm going to get to the second part of that right now. Yeah. Before it started to decline. So on the upside, you might say, the railroads increased Midwestern influence. The question is, what about the downside as people, stop using railroads, or to say famously, I think the big change, especially in the time, is the automobile. The automobile really made a huge difference. Some of my students who took the class may remember, I used to do a lecture on Henry Ford's influence on society. And it was precisely by making the automobile into an item of mass consumption. So there's no question at all we become more mobile as a result. And as we are more mobile, we are less likely to spend as much time in the same community. I'm not so sure it's a matter of density as a matter of mobility. We can move all over. I mean, big cities always have smaller communities. When we first moved to New York City, people didn't identify themselves as residents of New York City. They were residents of Murray Hill, of Carnegie Hill, of Brooklyn Heights, you name the community. So you can have community with density, but it is the mobility, the sense that people are rooted in not necessarily the exact same place, but close enough. That's changed. Now, interestingly, are we seeing a reverse of that? Are people, I mean, from what I read, for example, about the employment sector, people aren't as likely to move as they used to be in search of jobs. I'm not sure how true that is. We also know there's been a big movement of people into the South and Sun Belt from the cities of the North. So I think, just to finish, and you're clearly on the right track in asking, what about the means of transportation? How does that affect our civicness? And I'm not sure we have a really good understanding. Putnam did look, just to finish, at whether or not mobility was a factor in the bowling alone phase. He concluded it wasn't. I don't know that that's necessarily right going forward. So thank you.
If I may just add a point. Putnam did say that there was a small influence, but it was paled in comparison to influences such as television and electronic entertainment as a corrosive factor in civil society. Anybody else?
First of all, Les, I just want to thank you. It was just really well done.
Thank you.
Thank you. One observation is, today, there are about 12 million employees in the United States who are employed in the nonprofit sector, about the same as manufacturing.
As a whole, yeah, in the nonprofit sector. Yeah, go ahead.
And so the question is, maybe we're not individually as we don't volunteer as much individually as we did 60, 70 years ago, but maybe we've delegated that to nonprofit organizations through gifts, or through, sometimes maybe we feel through our tax dollars, so that we allow them to do the work that we were doing for individually. Do you think there's something to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Marty said, when I went on leave from IU, I headed an agency then known as the Corporation for National and Community Service. Some of you may be familiar with its main program, AmeriCorps. Do we have any AmeriCorps alums in the audience? No. But it recruits people to spend a year or two in various kinds of voluntary work. And I was very conscious of your point, because my job, newspaper used to refer to me as the CEO of volunteering, kind of an oxymoron there. But I was very conscious of this trade-off, and I had a line in one of my speeches I used over and over again. If you were in the hospital for a minor procedure, but it required you to stay overnight, say an appendectomy or something like that, when you wake up from your operation, would you, in the intensive care unit, would you rather be looking at a registered nurse or a person we used to call, I'm not even sure this word is in use anymore, a candy striper? A candy striper with red and white striped IU uniforms was a volunteer, often a high school student, often female, who would come around with magazines and all sorts of things, flowers maybe to lighten your day. Well, of course, you'd like to have the option to choose depending on how sick you were, right? If you needed more care, you want to see the RN, not the candy striper. But candy stripers, like people who used to run the old gift shops at hospitals, usually it was a women's auxiliary or something like that, play a valuable role, and we've lost that. On the other hand, if you're very sick, getting better care is a good thing. So yes, I think it has been changing. We've also beginning to come up with new ways of volunteering. I am told that fraternities and sororities are now adopting volunteer projects where they tutor kids on the internet, right? So if somebody was having trouble with algebra, you could get a volunteer tutor or something like that. There may be similar things in healthcare, probably having to do with helping people get needed tests or things like that. So yes, things change, but I don't think we can say that the change has results in one direction. It is more complicated than that. It is certainly something, one of the reasons I used to make this talk and use this line was I don't think, our leaders, including our leaders, I'm sorry to say, in the nonprofit sector, are often as candid about this as they should be. The leading lobby for nonprofits in Washington goes by the name of Independent Sector. I have written publicly, I'm not well liked as a result, that it should change its name to Dependent Sector, because most of what it lobbies for are more government financing or regulation of nonprofit. Now, I'm not against government financing, but I think we need to stand for what makes civil society important, which is its independence.
Do we have anyone else? Oh, couple people. Well,
You can choose your wife. It's okay.
yeah, I'm gonna, so I'm not playing favorites for my spouse. I'll go for the lady in the back here.
At 77, it's age 78 that makes me optimistic. Well, I do see this. I mean, I think it's, and this is why I've always been so pleased to work with Liberty Fund and similar groups. It's trying to put these things in perspective. So let me ask you a question. I'll answer a question. This is Pierre Goodrich's style. I will answer a question by asking a question. In what year did we have a pandemic, a war going on, enormous political turmoil, including a presidential election between two candidates nobody wanted, etc.? What year was that, Jenna? 1968. I was there. That's how I got my start. And when you think about that, I don't mean to minimize the problems we face today, particularly for younger people who have to deal with them a lot more than I will. We've been through this before. They are difficult. They are complicated, but we've come through them. And what makes me most optimistic is just that perspective. Now, yes, things have changed. I'm particularly concerned. I mean, one of the inspiring things about reading about Pierre Goodrich, and even more his father, was just how capable our political leaders were in those days. It's hard to have quite as much confidence in that today. But again, one shouldn't, look only at the folks you see on the nightly news shows. One needs to keep in mind it is a very big country with a lot of people in it, and we may not be able to identify them at a moment. In 1968, for example, no one took Ronald Reagan seriously as a political leader. He was an actor who managed to capitalize on his fame to win a governorship and made a good speech. But political leader, give me a break. Well, he turned out to be a pretty good leader. You may not agree with it all, but arguably he was. We can't identify today who's going to emerge like that. And what makes me optimistic is the hope that somebody will, and what makes me pessimistic, or at least nervous, is I can't say who.
Fundamentally, you need relationship, and you need leisure and time to develop relationship. And so we now have, starting coincidentally in the 1950s and 60s, we now have families that can't be families secure if they don't have two working parents. We have mandatory overtime, and we have a diminishing power of the dollar in terms of what my dollar will provide for my family. So I think the constriction in leisure, and specifically two working parents with mandatory overtime, is, unless we deal with it, it will be insurmountable in terms of the relationship component of civil society, which speaks, of course, Dane, to designating people to do the charity work that I would like to do but don't have time to do. But it doesn't replace the relationship, so it's not equivalent.
Is
there a question in there?
To be concerned. It's okay, let me respond. It's certainly something to be concerned about, and clearly, the stresses on families, on individuals are much greater now. But when the Great Recession began in 2008, 2009, as some of you know, newspapers like to call me up and ask for quotes because they know I'll say something different from what everybody else is saying. And I got a lot of calls, and the basic argument at the time as the recession was beginning was, well, with people leaving the workforce, maybe we'll see a revival in volunteering. Okay, after all, I'm the CEO of volunteering. And I used to say, no, we wouldn't. And the reason was because a lot of those relationships you are talking about actually grow out of the workplace. You come into work one morning and the person at the next desk says to you, gee, I'm doing something to deal with childhood diabetes or whatever it is. And so when those connections get snapped as people get laid off, volunteering doesn't go up, it actually goes down. We also need to, there certainly are things that we need to think about and be more conscious about. A new book is about to be published. We had a book party for the author at the School of Philanthropy on Wednesday. It's called The Soul of Civility, and the author is a woman named Alexandra Hudson, who's been involved with Liberty Fund in various ways. And Lexi, as she goes, has been talking about ways that are being invented to recreate those relationships, even with the stresses that all of us are under. She described one in Indianapolis called porching. We used to have front porches, and people would sit out and folks would walk by and chat. But increasingly, we've retreated inside. In fact, from what I've seen, I'm only very casually, thanks to you and others, driven around Winchester. Still quite a few front porches around here. But you go in Indianapolis and you don't see as many of them. Well, what this woman that Lexi describes is doing is inviting people over to her front porch on a Sunday morning or sometime just to chat. And she's not doing it by accident, it's an intentional. Somebody new moves into the neighborhood, invite them to the front porch. And there are other things that are struggling. I know I've just been contacted for something the School of Philanthropy may do. Will these offset, the economic pressures that families find themselves under? For me, by the way, I didn't include this, but another factor that reduces charitable giving and volunteering is the increase in single-parent families. And exactly. We know this. But what we don't know is, what do we do to change that trend? My advisor, as Marty said, called it to national attention in the 1960s. And it's gotten worse since then, much worse. It would be nice to try and change that, but in the absence, we need to be creative in thinking about ways we can restore community life given the very different lives people in communities have today.
So I'm 20 years old and I work full-time with overtime and then go back to work after my job during the day, almost every day. So I'm a victim of the system that we were just talking about, of being stripped of our free time for economic freedom. So my question to you is, with such a packed schedule as a young person, I have already suffered from losing my connections. Do you believe that this poses a threat to future philanthropeutic ideas and thinking
Actually,
in the future?
I don't, and I'll tell you why. I used to do this, I don't mean to be disrespectful. I certainly understand the strains you're under. When we started doing the surveys of volunteering, again to our surprise, of all the demographic groups we looked at, the one with the lowest rate of volunteering were people between the ages of 18 and 25. This was back in 2002, and it has not changed since. People my age, over 65, have a higher rate of volunteering. Let me tell you, the aches and pains sometimes can be a problem. And I would, of course, talk about this in my talk. But we also know that the best thing about being young is you don't stay young forever. You are going to get old. Young people get old. And we also know from the data that as people get older, they tend to become more civic-minded, especially when they are married, having families, having a house, kids going to school, etc. I used to say between 18 and 25, and then also 18, 25, volunteering's low. Then people got into what I called the Sex and the City generation. They're hustling around looking, to bolster their personal and professional careers. Volunteering is of secondary importance. But once they get into their 30s, we know the rates start to go up. Why? They become part of a community. Yes, they're still, as we were just discussing, they're still under a lot of stress. They may have overtime and low pay and double work. But, again, that's why, it's ironical volunteering is not always voluntary. And if you're looking at it from the point of view of building community, that really doesn't bother me a lot. After all, AmeriCorps gives the young people who volunteer a stipend for the year or two they will spend in service. A lot of critics have said, what, you're paying people to volunteer? Terrible, terrible idea. And I never dared say this publicly, but I used to want to say, well, last I know, people who served in the military volunteered and we paid them. And we do not call them mercenaries, we call them patriots. And the same is true, I think, when people are volunteering for reasons that may not be completely altruistic, may not be altruistic at all. The real question is what happens as a result. Bill Clinton said he said that, but it was wrong. No, he didn't say that. But go ahead, Ed, there's a question behind that. He actually didn't think it was good. He thought it was exceptional. It was unusual. He thought there were a lot, for example, as you might expect, the son of a minor French aristocrat or the descendant of a had very high standards in the arts and literature. And he found that wanting in the United States. He felt that there would never be any great art or literature in the United States. On the other hand, people managed to make this new idea of liberty, of equality, work. And that was the most important thing as he saw it.
Well, I think we're getting. Oh, Pete. No, if you've got a question, I want to hear it.
I do have a short, hopefully a short question, but maybe it ties in with some of the other things we were talking about. But you mentioned a couple of times in passing the idea of, especially in your introductory remarks, about individual freedom, about how important that was for Mr. Goodrich. Can you say something about what you see as the relationship between civil society and a society of free and responsible individuals? Or to put it maybe more pointedly, what do chess clubs and birdwatching associations have to do with individual liberty?
Right. Well, I think any of us who ever participated in a club know that whether it's chess or bird watching or anything else, we have to live by certain rules that the club establishes. We cannot, if we wanted the club, say, to do A, insist on it, even if other members wanted it to do B, C, or D. We learn to compromise what, as you know, is often called self-interest rightly understood. And that is the essence of responsibility and order. So it is, in a sense, in the relationships we have in these groups that we learn how to behave in civil society. If I could do one thing, magic wand when I'm 78, it would be to get the legal profession to stop doing plea bargaining. Tocqueville not only said that civic associations helped create community roots, but so did jury trials. He was a big fan of jury trials. He felt in a jury trial, 12 citizens for however long the trial lasted, had to learn how to, in effect, imitate what public leaders were doing in a microcosm. Now, I'm not naive. I understand why we have plea bar. My son's a lawyer. He'll tell me if I ever forget. But we have, again, it's not unlike replacing volunteers with professionals. We make trade-offs, and modern society makes a lot of them, and they have a cost that we don't always recognize, and the cost is to our civic life. And we are seeing the penalties now, but we need to be even more creative in that science of association to figure out new ways to build them.